This is CAST's definition of universal design for learning. Universal design for learning is a framework, and the framework is meant to help you design flexible lessons. We talk about the methods, the materials, and the environment. And the goal of those lessons is to minimize barriers, embrace human variability, develop learner agency for all. These are the Universal Design for Learning guidelines. And basically what these are kind of 9 different things that you need to think about when you're designing. When we're designing a lesson, we need to think about welcoming interests and identities. We need to think about making sure that everybody can perceive. We need to think about how are people going to interact with the materials. You want to make sure that you're thinking about what barriers exist, and then you only have to design for those barriers. The issue is we are really trained to kind of blame our students for problems. We try to help people learn to reframe how they're thinking about problems. A traditional way of talking would be saying, this student did poorly because she couldn't read well enough to learn the content. UDL says, actually, the student did poorly because the lesson required her to read in order to learn the content. Hopefully you see now that UDL sees that barriers are in the design, not the individual. Basically, access is just making sure that there aren't barriers to students learning. So an obvious one would be if you have a student who's blind and you hand them a printed book, that's a barrier. You need to offer the book in a way that they can access it. Agency then is about the idea of empowering learners to initiate their own path. How am I going to design for access? I might give lots of options for students to engage in a way that makes them feel welcome. In representation, make sure there's options, audio options, visual options. Give them an option for how they can interact. Do they have to work on a team? Maybe they need to work alone. Maybe they need to work with a partner. And then finally, how do you design for agents? Give them time for reflection. What worked for me? What didn't? What am I going to do differently next time? Help them to identify patterns in lessons and across lessons so that they can see these patterns in their larger life. Help students identify barriers themselves and then come up with a solution. Hopefully now you have figured out and understand that 2 foundational concepts to UDL, barriers are in the how we're designing, and that we want to design for access and agency.
This is by Allison White in Los Altos. She's doing this with TK students, which if you're back east, TK is like transitional kindergarten. These are 4.5-year-olds that are not quite ready necessarily for kindergarten. Age-wise, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, intrinsic motivation, and ownership and engagement. Like I said, Jennifer, that doesn't happen on a worksheet. Here's questions that the teachers facilitated with kids. And then this part of the screen, which I'm going to use my magic pen on, this part of the screen is Learning Genie making the lessons for us. This was her approach. It involved the whole class in the lesson. There was student interest in learning about volcanoes. They spent one day doing read-alouds of nonfiction books. The next day, they created a list of specific wonderings and volcanoes, and they dropped them into Learning Genie. Some of the concepts here would be ELD groups. What about talking about favorite foods in an ELD group? For RTI students, they can help. RTI sometimes, would you agree, Jennifer? It's just a different set of worksheets. But if you can say, let's brainstorm books we might want to read, and then build a lesson around it, it's just a whole different feel for kids. And then I just love the idea of whole class lesson design and using protocols like thin slides or other protocols. Each student gets a voice.